On the morning of September 14, 56 BC, a Roman scouting party of 12 men entered the sacred grove of Brocéliande, in what is now Brittany, France. By nightfall, only one would emerge alive, clutching the severed head of his commanding officer, babbling incoherently about, the guardian with tusks like bronze swords. The survivor, a legionary named Marcus Tullius Varro, would spend 3 days under guard before he could form coherent sentences. When he finally spoke, his testimony was so disturbing that Julius Caesar himself ordered it sealed in the military archives. The official report listed the cause of death as ambush by Gallic warriors, but the truth was far more terrifying before we uncovered the truth about the Druid Grove's sacred boar of 56 BC Gaul, the wild pig that guarded an oak circle and gored Julius Caesar's scout. Make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest corners of history that textbooks won't tell you about. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. The year is 56 BC, and the Roman Republic stands at the height of its power. Julius Caesar, already a legend among his men, has spent 3 years subjugating the Gallic tribes of modern-day France. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, his personal war journals, speak of brave warriors, strategic victories, and the civilizing mission of Rome. What they don't mention are the groves. Celtic Gaul was a land of deep spiritual significance, where religion and daily life intertwined inseparably. The Druids, a priestly caste of considerable power, maintained sacred spaces throughout the forests of Gaul. These weren't simple clearings, or temples, they were living sanctuaries, places where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods grew thin as morning mist. The grove at Brocéliande was among the most ancient and revered. Located in the heart of what would later become the legendary forest of Brocéliande in Brittany, this particular sanctuary predated even the oldest Druidic records. Local tribes, the Veneti, the Coriosolites, and the Osismii, all paid homage to this place despite their frequent conflicts with one another. War parties would march miles out of their way to avoid even seeing the grove from a distance. At the center of the grove stood 7 oak trees arranged in a perfect circle, their branches so densely interwoven that even at midday, the ground beneath remained in perpetual twilight. Ancient carvings covered their trunks, spirals, triscles, and symbols whose meanings had been lost even to the Druids of Caesar's time. The Roman military machine was methodical in its conquest. Before engaging in pitched battles, Caesar's officers would send scouting parties, exploratores, to map terrain, identify water sources, and locate enemy positions. These weren't mere soldiers. They were trained observers, men who could read aches, assess fortifications, and return with actionable intelligence. Tribune Gaius Marcellus commanded one such party. A career officer from a minor patrician family, Marcellus had served under Caesar for 6 years, earning a reputation for thoroughness and courage. His reports were so detailed that Caesar often read them verbatim to his officers during strategic planning sessions. In early September of 56 BC, Marcellus received orders to scout the interior territories of the Veneti, a powerful maritime tribe that had dared to imprison Roman ambassadors. The mission was straightforward: map the forest paths, locate tribal settlements, and identify potential staging grounds for the legions to follow. But there was one location marked on Marcellus's map with a crude skull symbol, a warning added by a captured Gallic warrior during interrogation: the Grove of Brocéliande. "No man enters the circle and lives," the prisoner had said through broken teeth. "The guardian does not distinguish between Gaul and Roman. It serves only the gods." Roman officers did not believe in superstitions. They believed in steel, discipline, and the inevitable march of civilization. Marcellus saw the grove not as sacred ground, but as a potential staging area, a clearing large enough to assemble cohorts, with mature trees that could be harvested for siege engines. On September 13th, Marcellus's party of 12 men set out from the Roman camp at dawn. Among them were veterans of campaigns in Hispania and Germania, men who had faced charging cavalry in ambush by painted warriors. They carried standard scouting equipment, surveying tools, wax tablets for notes, hunting spears, and short gladii for close combat. According to Varro's later testimony, the men were in good spirits. They joked about Gallic superstitions and made wagers about which man would be first to climb the sacred oaks. One soldier, a Spaniard named Vibius, had brought a small axe specifically to carve his initials into the largest tree as a gift to the savage gods. They had no idea that they were walking into something far older and darker than tribal superstition. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 hours into their march. The birds stopped singing. Experienced scouts know forest sounds the way sailors know the sea. Birds sing until threatened. Squirrels chatter. Insects drone. The forest lives in layers of sound, and when those sounds cease, predators are near. Marcellus ordered silence, Varro would later recall, his voice still trembling years after the event. We drew weapons and formed a defensive line, expecting Gallic warriors to burst from the undergrowth. But nothing came. The silence was absolute, not even wind in the leaves. The party pressed forward, tension mounting with each step. The surveying mission was forgotten. Now they moved as soldiers, in hostile territory. Shields raised, eyes scanning the dense foliage. Then they found the markers. Arranged along the path at regular intervals were stakes driven into the earth. Atop each stake sat a boar's skull, bleached white by sun and weather, empty eye sockets staring down the trail. The skulls were massive, far larger than any wild pig the Romans had encountered. Their tusks, still attached, curved upward like scythes, some measuring as long as a man's forearm. "I've hunted boar in Italia," Marcellus reportedly said, examining one of the skulls. "This is impossible. No pig grows this large." But the evidence was there in his hands. He ordered one skull taken as proof, wrapped in cloth and secured to a pack. The second incident occurred when they reached the outer boundary of the grove. The tree line ended abruptly, as if cut by a blade. Beyond it lay a circular clearing perhaps 200 paces across, dominated by the 7 ancient oaks at its center. The ground was bare earth, packed hard by centuries of ritual use. No grass grew within the circle. No mushrooms, no moss, nothing living except those 7 trees. And the smell. "It hit us like a physical force," Varro testified. The stench of decay, but not normal rot, sweeter, thicker, like something had been dead for months in summer heat, but it was autumn and the air was cool. Marcellus ordered 4 men to remain at the tree line as sentries while he led the others into the clearing. The Tribune was methodical, even in the face of growing unease. He wanted measurements, soil samples, and sketches of the oak formation. That's when they found the offerings. Arranged around the base of each oak were items of staggering value: golden torques, silver arm rings, bronze weapons inlaid with coral and amber, pottery filled with what had once been wine or mead. But more disturbing were the organic offerings, piles of bones, both animal and human, stacked in neat cairns. Some were fresh enough that dried flesh still clung to them. Vibius, the Spanish soldier with the axe, laughed nervously. "Rich pickings here, lads. Caesar would reward us well for such treasures." He reached for a golden torque. The ground exploded. Not metaphorically, the packed earth at the center of the oak circle burst upward in a geyser of soil and roots, as if something massive had been buried just beneath the surface. The men stumbled backward, shouting in confusion, hands fumbling for weapons. From the churned earth emerged the guardian. It was like no boar that nature had made, Varro's testimony reads, standing as tall at the shoulder as a warhorse, with a body that seemed to be more scar tissue than hide. Its tusks were the color of old bronze, chipped and notched from countless battles. But its eyes, gods preserve me, its eyes held intelligence. It looked at us and saw us not as threats, but as transgressions. The creature didn't charge immediately. It stood in the center of the circle, head lowered, breathing in great bellows-like heaves. The stench intensified. Now the men could see that the boar's flanks were matted with dried blood, some old, some relatively fresh. Flies swarmed around it in a black cloud, but the beast paid them no attention. Its eyes fixed on Vibius, who still held the golden torque in his trembling hand. "Put it back," Marcellus ordered, his voice steady despite the terror evident in his face. Slowly, Vibius bent to return the torque to its pile. The boar moved. What happened next Varro could barely articulate. The beast crossed 30 paces in perhaps 2 seconds, moving with a speed that seemed to defy its massive size. Vibius didn't even have time to scream. The boar's tusks caught him in the midsection, lifting him bodily from the ground, shattering on impact. The beast didn't stop to finish its victims. It was already turning, seeking the next threat, the next transgressor in its sacred domain. One soldier, a Gaul who had joined the Roman auxiliary forces, threw down his weapons and ran for the tree line. The boar caught him in 5 strides, its tusks punching through the man's back and erupting from his chest in a fountain of blood. Varro found himself separated from the others, his shield lost, armed only with his gladius. He watched in horror as the creature methodically destroyed his companions. not with the mindless savagery of an animal, but with terrible purpose. It seemed to prioritize those who had touched the offerings, who had shown disrespect for the sacred space. Tribune Marcellus, to his credit, died bravely. He charged the beast with a spear, actually managing to drive the point into its shoulder. The boar barely noticed. It caught Marcellus in its jaws. Yes, its jaws. Varro was adamant about this detail, and bit down with such force that the tribune's skull simply came apart. The 4 sentries at the tree line had broken and run at the first sounds of slaughter. Varro would later learn that none of them made it back to camp. Their bodies were found days later, scattered along the path, each bearing the same wounds, massive puncture wounds from bronze-colored tusks. Varro survived through a combination of luck and paralysis. When the beast had finished, with the others, it turned toward him, blood streaming from its muzzle, flies swarming thick around its head. They stood facing each other for what felt like hours but was likely only seconds. Then the boar did something that would haunt Varro for the rest of his life. It nodded, a deliberate, almost human gesture of acknowledgement, and it returned to the center of the circle, lowered itself to the ground, and began to dig, burying itself once more beneath the packed earth, until only its eyes remained visible, watching, waiting. Varro ran, and shaking him like a dog shakes a rat. The sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone echoed across the clearing. "To me!" Marcellus roared, and the Romans formed a testudo, the famous tortoise formation, shields locked together. It was an instinctive response, drilled into them through years of training. It saved no one. The boar dropped Vibius's corpse and charged the formation. 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury struck the shield wall like a battering ram. Men flew backward, bones shattering on impact. The beast didn't stop to finish its victims. It was already turning, seeking the next threat, the next transgressor in its sacred domain. One soldier, a Gaul who had joined the Roman auxiliary forces, threw down his weapons and ran for the tree line. The boar caught him in 5 strides, its tusks punching through the man's back and erupting from his chest in a fountain of blood. Varro found himself separated from the others, his shield lost, armed only with his gladius. He watched in horror as the creature methodically destroyed his companions, not with the mindless savagery of an animal, but with terrible purpose. It seemed to prioritize those who had touched the offerings, who had shown disrespect for the sacred space. Tribune Marcellus, to his credit, died bravely. He charged the beast with a spear, actually managing to drive the point into its shoulder. The boar barely noticed. It caught Marcellus in its jaws. Yes, its jaws. Varro was adamant about this detail, and bit down with such force that the tribune's skull simply came apart. The 4 sentries at the tree line had broken and run at the first sounds of slaughter. Varro would later learn that none of them made it back to camp. Their bodies were found days later, scattered along the path, each bearing the same wounds, massive puncture wounds from bronze-colored tusks. Varro survived through a combination of luck and paralysis. When the beast had finished with the others, it turned toward him, blood streaming from its muzzle, flies swarming thick around its head. They stood facing each other for what felt like hours but was likely only seconds. Then the boar did something that would haunt Varro for the rest of his life. It nodded, a deliberate, almost human gesture of acknowledgement, and it returned to the center of the circle, lowered itself to the ground, and began to dig, burying itself once more beneath the packed earth, until only its eyes remained visible, watching, waiting. Varro ran. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button to let us know you want more forgotten horrors from history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and ancient legends. The investigation that followed would shake the foundations of Roman military doctrine. Let's discover what happens next. When Marcus Tullius Varro stumbled into the Roman camp 3 days later, he carried Tribune Marcellus's head in a cloth sack. Not the skull. The head, severed cleanly at the neck, partially preserved by the cool autumn air. Camp guards almost killed him on sight, mistaking him for a Gallic warrior bringing a trophy. Only his armor, though torn and blood-stained, identified him as Roman. Varro collapsed at the entrance to Caesar's command tent. When the guards lifted him, they found that he had worn the soles of his military sandals completely through. His feet were masses of infection and injury. He had run for 3 days straight, stopping only when exhaustion forced him to, never sleeping for more than an hour at a time. The beast were his first coherent words. The guardian, still there, still watching. Caesar himself ordered Varro placed under guard in the medical tent. The young legionaries' ravings were disturbing enough that Caesar worried about the effect on camp morale. Stories of supernatural creatures could spread through military camps like plague, destroying discipline and courage. But Caesar was also a practical man, and a curious one. He had Varro's testimony recorded by his personal secretary, Aulus Hirtius. Once the soldier had been sedated with wine and poppy. What Hirtius documented over the next several hours would become one of the most heavily suppressed documents in Roman military history. The details were horrifyingly specific. Varro described the location of each man's death, the nature of their wounds, the supernatural speed and intelligence of the creature. He drew diagrams of the oak circle, listing the offerings he had seen, estimating their value with the precision of a quartermaster. Most disturbing were his observations about the boar itself. This was no rabid animal or unusually large wild pig. Varro insisted it moved with purpose, that it seemed to understand the concept of sanctity, of punishment for transgression. It defended that place the way a legionary defends the eagle standard, Varro told Hirtius, with absolute devotion and lethal efficiency. Caesar faced a dilemma. He could not acknowledge supernatural threats. Such admissions would make him a laughingstock in Rome and potentially cost him political support. But he also could not ignore the loss of 12 trained soldiers, including a tribune, especially in the midst of a challenging campaign. He ordered a recovery mission. On September 20th, a century of 80 men, commanded by Centurion Lucius Atilius, marched to the grove. They found it exactly as Varro had described. The oak circle, the offerings, the packed earth at the center, showing signs of recent disturbance, and the bodies. We found 9 corpses in various states of dismemberment, Atilius's official report states, preserved in the military archives. The wounds were consistent with animal attack, specifically wild boar, but of unprecedented severity. One man had been essentially bisected at the waist. Another's rib cage had been crushed so thoroughly that his chest was nearly flat. The bodies had not been scavenged by other animals. They lay where they had fallen, untouched by wolves or carrion birds, as if even scavengers knew this place was forbidden. But of the boar itself they found no trace. Centurion Atilius ordered his men to form a perimeter and sent scouts to search the surrounding forest for tracks, burrows, anything that might indicate where such a creature could hide. They found naught. No tracks leaving the circle, no disturbed undergrowth, no den large enough to house an animal of the size Varro had described. One of Atilius's soldiers, braver or more foolish than the rest, approached the center of the circle with a spear, intent on probing the disturbed earth. His comrades watched as he drove the spear downward repeatedly, testing for a burrow or pit. On the 7th strike, the spear hit something solid. The soldier reported it felt like striking iron. He withdrew the spear. The point was bent. Atilius made a decision that likely saved his entire century. He ordered an immediate withdrawal, taking the bodies of the dead but touching nothing else in the grove. No offerings were collected. No oak trees were marked for harvesting. The sacred space was left exactly as they had found it. There are some territories, his report concludes, that Rome conquers not with sword but with wisdom. This place belongs to gods older than Jupiter, and we are not welcome here. Caesar, upon reading this report, made a notation in his personal journals, a passage that scholars would puzzle over for centuries. The Gauls possess weapons we do not understand, not of bronze or iron, but of faith made manifest. Such weapons cannot be defeated, only avoided. The recovery mission brought back something else. Samples of the offerings around the oaks. Gold torques, silver fibulae, bronze daggers. But also bones. Hundreds of bones carefully arranged, representing decades if not centuries of sacrifice. A Greek physician attached to Caesar's staff, Aristomenes of Rhodes, examined these remains. His analysis was disturbing. The bones showed evidence of predation by something with a bite force far exceeding any known animal. Some of the larger bones, femurs and pelvises, bore teeth marks that had actually begun to compress the dense marrow cavity. The jaw strength required for such damage would be comparable to a full-grown lion, yet the tooth pattern was distinctly porcine. More disturbing were the human bones. Carbon dating would not be invented for 2,000 years, but Aristomenes could determine relative age through bone deterioration and the style of injury. Some of these human sacrifices dated back hundreds of years. The most recent appeared to be only months old. This was not a single beast, Aristomenes wrote in his notes. Or if it was, it has lived far longer than nature permits. The pattern of offerings and victims suggests continuous occupation of this site for at least 3 centuries. always by the same type of guardian. Caesar ordered all physical evidence buried in a pit outside the camp, covered with quicklime, and never spoken of again. Varro was reassigned to garrison duty in northern Italia, far from Gaul, with a generous pension and explicit orders to speak of the incident to no one. The official casualty report listed Tribune Marcellus and his men as lost in action against Gallic ambush, September 14, 56 BC. But Caesar d.I. One more thing, something that would not be discovered until French archaeologists excavated Roman military sites in the 1960s. He issued orders to every legion under his command. The grove of Brocéliande was to be designated as cursed ground, off-limits to all Roman personnel under penalty of military execution. A wooden marker was erected at the entrance to the forest path, carved with the standard SPQR, and a warning in Latin. By order of Gaius Julius Caesar, proconsul of Gaul, no Roman citizen shall enter the sacred grove. This land belongs to gods who remember Rome's sins. The suppression of the Brocéliande incident set a precedent that would echo through centuries of Roman occupation in Gaul. Caesar, for all his military genius, understood that conquest was as much about psychology as it was about legions. His Commentari de Bello Gallico, his published war memoirs, make no mention of the massacre at the grove. Instead, he writes extensively about Roman victories, about the bravery of his soldiers, about the gradual civilizing of the savage Gallic tribes. But within the Roman military hierarchy, the incident became legend. Centurion Attilius, who had led the recovery mission, was reassigned to Caesar's personal guard, an unusual honor for an officer who had technically failed to secure a military objective. Historians believe this promotion was actually strategic. Caesar wanted Attilius close, where his testimony could be controlled, his letters censored, his conversations monitored. Attilius would serve with distinction for another 12 years, participating in the conquest of Germania and the invasion of Britannia. But according to letters discovered in 2003 CE by researchers at the École Normale Supérieure, letters written to his brother in Rome, Attilius never forgot what he had seen at Brocéliande. There are places in this world, one letter reads, where the old powers still hold sway, where the gods our fathers knew before Jupiter and Mars still demand their due. We Romans pride ourselves on reason, on law, on the inevitable march of civilization. But civilization is merely a torch in the darkness, brother, and that darkness is far deeper than we imagine. Marcus Tullius Varro, the sole survivor, lived another 43 years. His reassignment to a quiet garrison in northern Italia should have been a peaceful end to his military career. Instead, it became a different kind of torture. Varro developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from night terrors, screaming about bronze tusks and watching eyes. He became convinced that the guardian of Brocéliande could track him anywhere, that his survival had been temporary mercy, that the beast would eventually come to finish what it had started. Fellow soldiers reported that Varro would sometimes stand watch all night, staring into the darkness beyond the garrison walls, convinced he could hear the sound of massive hooves approach. Ching. He refused to eat pork in any form, would become violently ill at the sight of boar's meat in the mess hall. In 22 BC, at age 59, Varro threw himself from the walls of his garrison. His suicide note, preserved in military records, consisted of a single sentence: "It has finally come for me." But the most intriguing aftermath of the Brocéliande incident was not what happened to the survivors, but what happened at the grove itself. Caesar's orders to avoid the sacred space were observed with religious devotion. For the next 4 centuries of Roman occupation of Gaul, that grove remained untouched. No roads were built near it. No villas were constructed within 5 miles of its boundaries. The local Gallic tribes, observing this unusual Roman restraint, took it as acknowledgement of the old god's power. Archaeological evidence suggests that offerings at the grove actually increased during the Roman period. Pottery fragments bearing Latin inscriptions have been found at the site, indicating that even some Romans, despite official prohibitions, made pilgrimages to leave gifts for the guardian. One such inscription, discovered in 1987, reads, "To the Beast of the Oaks, protector of the threshold between worlds, I, Quintus Fabius Maximus, offer this wine in gratitude for safe passage through lands you guard. May your tusks remain sharp and your vigil eternal." The Roman military maintained detailed casualty records, and researchers have identified a curious pattern in deaths recorded in the Brocéliande region throughout the occupation. Approximately every 7 to 12 years, a small group of soldiers, usually 3 to 7 men, would be reported as missing in action in the same general area. The bodies, when recovered, always showed similar trauma, massive penetrating wounds, evidence of attack by large tusked animals, signs of having been pursued through dense forest. Perhaps most tellingly, these incidents would invariably occur after reports of Roman soldiers attempting to enter the grove despite Caesar's prohibition. Some were deserters hoping to hide there. Some were treasure hunters seeking the legendary golden offerings. Some were simply young soldiers daring each other to test the old stories. None survived their trespasses. The pattern continued even after the fall of Rome. Frankish knights in the 6th century CE reported similar attacks. Charlemagne's chronicles mention the demon pig of the old forest, as a creature that even his fearless paladins would not confront. Medieval texts describe it as one of the wild hunt's guardians, a beast of otherworldly origin that served neither god nor devil but some older, stranger power. By the 12th century, the grove had become the foundation for the Arthurian legends of the Forest of Brocéliande, appearing in texts like Chrétien de Troyes' romances. But careful readers will note that even in these romantic tales, certain clearings in the forest are described as places where no nigh, however brave, should venture. The last documented attack attributed to the guardian of Brocéliande occurred in 1477 CE. A hunting party led by Duke Francis II of Brittany pursued a wounded stag into the old forest. 4 men entered a clearing matching descriptions of the ancient oak circle. Only the Duke emerged, refusing ever to speak of what he had witnessed, but bearing massive scars across his torso consistent with goring by an enormous boar. Francis II immediately issued a ducal decree, still preserved in French national archives, forbidding anyone from entering the Circle of 7 Oaks, wherein dwells the eternal guardian, last servant of the old gods. The Protestant Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment brought new attitudes toward such superstitions. By the 18th century, educated Europeans dismissed the Beast of Brocéliande as folklore, a cautionary tale born from genuine boar attacks and amplified by ignorant peasants. That dismissal ended in 1863. A French military surveying team, mapping the interior of Brittany for railway development, rediscovered the grove. The 7 Oaks still stood, impossibly ancient, their interwoven branches now supporting entire ecosystems of moss and ferns. The ground within the circle remained bare earth, though the surrounding forest had encroached to within 20 paces of the original boundary. The surveyors noted something else: fresh offerings, modern offerings, coins bearing dates from the 1850s, bottles of wine, even a military medal from the Napoleonic Wars. Local villagers, when questioned, admitted that offerings continued to be left at the grove, though most claimed not to know why. "Our grandmothers told us to," one elderly woman explained, "and their grandmothers before them. You leave a gift for the guardian, or you don't enter the forest. That's simply how things are." The surveying team dismissed this as quaint superstition. They camped within the oak circle, using the ancient trees as tent posts. All 4 men were found dead the next morning. The official investigation declared it a wild boar attack, though the lead investigator privately noted that no boar of such size has been documented in France in recorded history. The railway was rerouted 40 miles to the south. The grove at Brocéliande remains standing today, now protected as a historical site by the French government. The 7 Oaks, estimated to be at least 2,500 years old, are among the oldest living trees in Europe. The site receives approximately 15,000 visitors per year, tourists seeking the legendary locations of Arthurian romance. But locals still leave offerings. Park rangers regularly clear away coins, bottles, small sculptures, and written prayers from the base of the oaks. When asked why people continue this practice in the 21st century, one ranger simply shrugged. "Some traditions," she said, "exist because they keep us safe. We may not understand them, but that doesn't make them invalid." The story of B. Brocéliande's guardian forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality and the limits of rational explanation. For skeptics, the incident represents a perfect storm of misidentification, exaggeration, and cultural mythology. Wild boars can indeed grow to enormous sizes. The largest recorded wild boar, shot in Turkey in 2004, weighed over 1,000 pounds. Attacks by such animals, while rare, are documented as extraordinarily violent. Roman soldiers, already superstitious and operating in hostile territory, could easily have encountered an unusually large boar defending its territory, and interpreted the attack through the lens of local religious beliefs. This explanation satisfies Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually correct. A big pig, a scared group of soldiers, and a cultural context that primed them to interpret natural phenomena as supernatural. But this explanation struggles with certain details. The sheer consistency of attacks over such a vast span of time, from pre-Roman Gaul through the 15th century, suggests either multiple animals exhibiting identical behavior in the same location, or something we don't fully understand about how certain places accumulate and maintain dangerous wildlife populations. The targeting of only those who violated the sacred space is harder to explain. Numerous accounts describe people passing near the grove without incident, while those who entered with intent to desecrate or plunder were invariably killed. This pattern suggests either remarkable coincidence or some form of territorial intelligence beyond typical animal behavior. From an anthropological perspective, the Brocéliande incident illuminates the complex relationship between colonizing and indigenous cultures. Caesar, for all his military superiority, recognized that some aspects of Gallic culture could not be conquered through force. The decision to leave the grove untouched represents a rare moment of Roman cultural humility, an acknowledgement that not everything could or should be brought under the aegis of Roman law. This created a precedent that would echo through imperial history. When cultures in conflict encounter genuinely inexplicable phenomena, whether supernatural or simply beyond current understanding, the wise course is often coexistence rather than confrontation. The psychological impact of the incident on Roman military doctrine was profound. Caesar's legions, which had faced down Germanic tribes, crossed the Rhine, and invaded Britannia, drew a line at a clearing in a forest. This wasn't cowardice but strategic pragmatism. Some battles cannot be won, and recognizing that fact is a mark of genuine intelligence. Modern military theory still grapples with similar concepts. How do you fight an enemy you don't understand? When does tactical retreat become strategic wisdom? The Romans at Brocéliande chose survival over pride, and in doing so perhaps demonstrated more courage than if they had sent legion after legi. On to their deaths in that oak circle. From an ecological perspective, the story raises fascinating questions about apex predators and sacred spaces. Throughout history, certain locations have maintained reputations as dangerous, as forbidden, as places where humans should not go. Modern conservation has rediscovered the wisdom in this approach. No-go zones, areas where human access is prohibited, often become refuges for biodiversity, allowing ecosystems to function without anthropogenic interference. Could the Gallic prohibition on entering the grove have served a similar function? By designating certain spaces as sacred and dangerous, ancient cultures may have inadvertently created protected areas where wildlife thrived. The guardian might have been real wildlife, protected by cultural taboos that ensured minimal human interference. The incident also speaks to questions of cultural memory and the transmission of knowledge across generations. The villagers of Brittany in the 19th century still left offerings at a grove whose original religious context had been dead for over 1,000 years. They couldn't explain why, but they knew it was important. This suggests that crucial survival information can be encoded in ritual and tradition, preserved even when the rational explanation is lost. The people who continued leaving offerings couldn't explain the guardian, but their ancestors' experiences had created a cultural immune response. Avoid this place, respect these boundaries, or suffer consequences. Perhaps the most profound implication is what the story reveals about the limits of human dominion. We like to believe that with sufficient technology and knowledge, we can understand and control anything. The Roman Empire believed this. The Age of Enlightenment believed this. The modern world certainly believes this. But there remain places, call them cursed, call them sacred, call them simply mysterious, where our explanations fall short, where the boundaries between myth and reality blur, where something old and patient watches from the shadows, guarding thresholds we're not meant to cross. The 7 oaks still stand in Brocéliande. The ground beneath them remains bare, and every few years, despite all security measures, despite cameras and rangers and scientific monitoring, fresh offerings appear at their roots. Someone, or something, is still keeping the old agreements. What do you think really haunted the grove of Brocéliande? Was it truly a supernatural guardian, or could there be a rational explanation we haven't considered yet? Was Marcus Tullius Varro simply traumatized by an encounter with an unusually large wild boar, or did he witness something that defied natural explanation? Leave your theories in the comments below. Are there places in your own region with similar legends, locations that locals warn you never to visit? We'd love to hear your stories. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's darkest mysteries, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Sermon. We bring you the forgotten horrors, the suppressed incidents, and the historical events too strange for textbooks every week. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who loves ancient mysteries and unexplained phenomena. And check out our video on the 9th Legion's disappearance in Scotland, another Roman military mystery with disturbing supernatural overtones. Until next time, remember, history is full of monsters. Some of them might still be watching. See you in the next video.